to put the slideshow
Yeah.
into full.
Yeah.
Technological difficulties
We're
always.
starting hands-on with that. Okay, so and then we do that.
Right.
And then
Yes, perfect.
move up and down.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay. So anyway, thank you so much for all, for coming and for having me here. So the first image that you see here is a photograph that was taken in New York in the loft of the artist Robert Rauschenberg in 1967. But as you can see, this is not really your typical artist studio scene. The man who's speaking at the podium is John Pierce, who was a high-level scientist and engineer at Bell Laboratories in the US. Floating above him is one of Andy Warhol's silver clouds, which not many people know was developed with another engineer, Billy Kluver, out of the brand new material at the time called Scotch Pack, which was being used at that moment to wrap sandwiches for the US Army. So how did this odd couple or couples wind up in Rauschenberg's studio? Now, Rauschenberg will be familiar to many of you as one of the stars of the collection here at Moderne Musee as well. But far less known is his involvement in an extraordinary organization called Experiments in Art and Technology with the physicist and engineer Billy Kluver. And the official launch of that organization, EAT for short, is what you see here in this photo. And I'd like to talk about EAT, this group, and the collaboration between Rauschenberg and Kluver, really focusing on that given the ties to the place that we're in right now. Now, Rauschenberg's own art, just to give you a bit of background, was an art of putting things together. He called many of his main works combines, but in my view, it didn't always add up. And here you see one of the most important assemblages titled Allegory from 1959-1960. Rauschenberg's collaboration with other people, the many connections he created, were more than the sum of their parts, but they were also less. They defied the simplicity of addition, never resolving into an easy union between things and people, never settling into conventional hierarchies between artist and material, or tool and system, or part and whole. These strange relationships found their fullest form in Experiments in Art and Technology. And Rauschenberg began the organization, as I mentioned, with, among others, the Swedish physicist and engineer Billy Kluver. And you see Kluver on the left here and Rauschenberg on the right. And they started the group in 1966. They wanted to form an alliance between artists and engineers to get artists and engineers to collaborate. But what they produced was really far more complicated. It was messy and divided, a vast and unruly kind of alchemy. And you see them here working on a piece that's called Oracle, a sound sculpture, quite early on in 1965. Art and technology more broadly were really divided in the late 1960s. They were infamously split between the so-called two cultures. Many feared that this divide between art and science or technology would lead to a nightmare of machines run amok, of technocratic domination, of nuclear winter, of ecological ruin. And it's obviously still resonant today. EAT echoed this fear, this alarm. And as the organization's manifesto proclaimed, culture and technology were dangerously developing in isolation. That's what they said in their manifesto. Now, EAT wanted to try and find a way to bring these fields together. If artists and engineers actually talked to one another, if they shared information, if they broke out of their specialized disciplines, they might actually change one another, change their disciplines, and change the structure of invention itself. Rauschenberg and Kluver met in 1960. Kluver was a specialist in lasers and optics at AT&T Bell Laboratories, the the famous research center of the modern telecommunications revolution. And you see their headquarters here in New Jersey. Oh, there's a Skype
Tommy
message.
Jensen is online.
I don't know how to. We'll just hope that no one else is Skyping in to
Tommy out of the room.
whoever owns this computer. Maybe he has something to add about Bell Labs.
Yeah.
But this is their headquarters, and actually later they would move into a new building designed by Eero Saarinen, which is another story. But a lot happened here. Famously, there were something like 14 Nobel Prizes. On the left, you see an anechoic chamber, which shuts down all sound and sensation on the left. On the right, you see two engineers who would actually go on to famously develop essentially the first computer sound and computer speech, so digital sound synthesis. And it was really this sort of locus of incredible thought and actually pure scientific research in what would normally be an applied research laboratory at the time of the efflorescence of big science, of large-scale laboratory research. And we can talk a bit more about this later in the Q&A as well. But back to the group, the curator Pontus Hultén, another fellow Swede, had introduced his friend Kluver to the artist Jean Tinguely, with whom he would work on this funny sculpture you see here, a kinetic piece called Homage to New York that was mechanical and destroyed itself in the sculpture garden of the Museum of Modern Art in 1960. There, Kluver actually met Rauschenberg. They struck up a friendship, and Kluver would go on to help Rauschenberg and other artists with various technical needs. But from project to project, from Jasper Johns' field painting from 1962, which you see on the left, to Warhol's Silver Clouds, which you saw on that first slide, Kluver's participation went beyond technical assistance. It altered the very form of the work. And you see Kluver here on the left with a neon letter R, which he devised for this painting. It's actually sticking out vertically, so from the frontal view, you can't see it, but at the top, it glows a little bit. And Johns wanted a neon light that wouldn't have a cord running from the painting. So to devise a battery system, a pack that had enough power and could be portable, hidden inside the painting, Kluver had to devise this very special light. And to this day, you can see this work in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. with this very messy electrical apparatus behind it. So Kluver and Rauschenberg, this is Silver Clouds again, more of the balloons. Kluver and Rauschenberg would go on to produce the transistor radio-powered sound-emitting sculpture Oracle from 1965, which you saw them at work in another slide. And this piece was literally shaped by its technological means. In other words, the form it took was really shaped by the input that Kluver had in the process. So the question arose, what if more artists and engineers could work together and exchange ideas, techniques, and media? What if they could generate something that neither would produce normally on their own? Or, as Rauschenberg wrote in a note in 1967, how could they, quote, make work that would not exist otherwise? So Kluver and Rauschenberg soon, back to Oracle. Kluver and Rauschenberg soon decided to find out. They embarked with a much larger group on a project called 9 Evenings, Theater and Engineering, a legendary performance series that would directly lead to the formation of EAT. The event was a huge enterprise. Its ambition was matched only by its size. It lasted 9 nights in the enormous 69th Regiment Armory in New York, and it was attended by more than 10,000 people. Nearly 40 engineers from Bell Laboratories worked with more than 10 artists. And their struggles, actually, with and against one another brought the tensions between the post-war laboratory and the artistic studio into unprecedented intimacy. Neither art nor technology would ever be the same. So you see this group assembled here in front of the Armory in New York. Now, Rauschenberg and Kluver began thinking about, or coming up with the idea of 9 Evenings in order to bring their one-to-one collaborations to a much larger scale. to see what would happen when not just a few, but a critical mass of artists and engineers explored new materials and new technologies. And initially they proposed this series to a Swedish performance festival, but disagreements actually sort of ended that project and they brought it to New York. So they connected with other artists, choreographers and musicians, including John Cage, Yvonne Rainer, and Deborah Hay, and you see some of them here, along with the engineers, around what would essentially become the central control panel and electrical switching panel for the performance series, but more about that in a moment. Kluver brought in Bell Labs colleagues who were researching everything from integrated circuits to making computers talk. Technologies that would usher in wireless communication, personal computing, and the internet. These were nothing less than the architects of the information age. So the first brainstorming meetings, now Sherilyn Hale is online. The first brainstorming meetings were rowdy. Proposals ranged from making use of Telstar, which was the first telecommunications satellite developed, and it was developed at Bell, to the filmic projection of brain waves, to a, quote, missile that could float, that was proposed by another Swedish artist, Oyvind Fallström. Rauschenberg himself hoped to, quote, use feedback through speakers and microphones carried by people to create variable sound. And in this way, the artist united two major ideas that would really run throughout 9 Evenings and then EAT. Information theory, the mid-century breakthrough made at Bell Labs, and its analysis of feedback systems, which use information in real time to dynamically predict and alter a future state. And the second idea, which is really Rauschenberg's own incredible vision throughout the 1960s of realizing an all-encompassing environment that would react flexibly to stimuli, such as bodily movement, light, and sound. This kind of feedback, Rauschenberg thought, could be let loose, it could run wild to generate an utterly unpredictable, constantly changing, and responsive field of sensation. And that field could be exponentially expanded through forces beyond the scale of the body alone, via amplification, circuits, electromagnetic waves. So in other words, you can create something that becomes reactive, but then also much larger than just scaled to the body. So what the artists and engineers needed most, in other words, was remote control. And Rauschenberg had actually articulated this specific desire in the making of Oracle, this piece, the previous year in 1965. He said, quote, I wanted to do something that was remote control, that could be separated in the room. He stipulated that no wires appear between these various components that you see here, so that the viewer could roam freely around and through the work. This was an enormous technological challenge. Transistorized portable electronic equipment had barely come onto the market in the early 1960s, and Kluver and Rauschenberg had to figure out how to deal with, quote, a nightmare of noise and interference while creating a completely wireless system, decades before wireless technologies would come to dominate communications media. And again, we can talk more about this later, but basically this had radios embedded in all of these kind of scrap metal pieces that Rauschenberg had found. And as you walk through, you could actually turn those knobs you see on the left top of this apparatus on the left, and that would indirectly change the stations that you were listening to, but there was a whole sort of complicated indirect relay of feedback as well. 9 Evenings built on the advances that Rauschenberg and Kluver had made in Oracle, testing these entirely new possibilities of remote control. All of the performances in 9 Evenings focused in some way on pushing the capacity to relay sensations, information, and force across space. And here you see John Cage using a sort of incredible sound apparatus that they developed for his piece in 9 Evenings. He beamed in far-flung sound transmissions from television stations, a microphone in a local restaurant, and even the turtle tank in Terry Riley's house. Yvonne Rainer, which you see her piece here, wanted walkie-talkies to transmit instructions from performers to herself and vice versa across the vast expanse of the armory. Deborah Hay, a choreographer, constructed with engineers remote-controlled motorized platforms on which dancers could ride, and you see these here. And then Steve Paxton, another choreographer, and an engineer named Dick Wolf, devised personal wireless handheld transistor radios with which audience members could walk around enormous inflated plastic tunnels, picking up different sound signals as they moved. You see a little crude sketch on the left. They have these essentially transmitting loops in the ceiling, and as you walked around with these handheld radios, you could pick up different signals. So 9 Evenings built on the advances that Rauschenberg and Kluwer had made, Indeed, within this vast expanse of the armory, where sounds could echo for as long as 5.5 seconds, all of the props and equipment demanded action at a distance. And so the group developed what they called a theater electronic environmental modular system, which they called TEAM for short, for the wireless remote control of lights, video, and other effects. And you saw a little glimpse of one of the switching components earlier. Here you see another with this huge cascade of wires coming out of the back. This had nearly 300 components, and it was used in some way in every performance. It was the kind of master system of 9 Evenings, and it was flexible and smart. So most of this electronic equipment was routed through this central control panel, and it allowed for remote control of elements on the stage like lights, loudspeakers, cameras, microphones, projectors, motors, and it did so through a novel system of transmitters and FM receivers. So it was possible to use a diversity of inputs, movement, sound, electrical signal, to then trigger a diversity of chains of command that would set in motion a whole range of effects and devices. A single device could function in a completely different way in different moments at time. Another Bell Labs engineer, Per Bjorn, compared the inordinate flexibility of this system to the first large-scale general-purpose computer, a groundbreaking way of connecting, processing, and sending information with a seemingly limitless set of applications and across a sweeping range. So TEAM, that central control system, was supplemented by another kind of translation. The engineer Herbert Schneider, who researched radio systems at Bell, created a unique series of diagrams that would map the links between the central control area and the devices, such as speakers, in the stage area. So you can see this whole almost sort of like flow chart, basically. Schneider's drawings were an innovation that both artists and engineers could understand. It was able to connect and integrate all the different participants and mechanisms, people, and data in the piece. So in other words, this is not a normal engineering diagram, nor was it something that an artist would, typically use. But even then, the artists and engineers had a hard time talking to each other. Roles were muddled. Artists were forced to give up control over composition and production. Engineers had to cobble together new technologies or make existing ones do things they were never meant to do. Artists found themselves doing boring tasks like stripping wires, and you see John Cage, Deborah Hay, and some engineers doing that here. The artists even described feeling lost, powerless. Some got physically sick. And you see Yvonne Rainer on the right here looking very dejected, and she actually has a crazy sort of set of diary entries from this period. Making 9 Evenings, in other words, was deeply traumatic as it was revelatory for its participants. On opening night, Kluwer said, quote, "There are 3 elements fighting: the artists, the engineers, and the audience. These 3 will have to come to some resolution," end quote. But the fight also included a 4th element, the technology, which misbehaved at every turn. Rauschenberg's own performance, which you see here, was called Open Score, and was developed with the engineer Robert Kaminsky. It was explicitly presented as a contest between artists and machines. So the artist Frank Stella, who many of you will know, and a tennis instructor, Mimi Kanarek, played an open-ended tennis match that went on without winner or loser, and you see them here. Instead of a normal game, the rackets had been hot-wired, and you see one of them here, so that each time they hit the ball, an echoing ping resounded, and lights were triggered to switch off until complete darkness reigned in the armory. Hundreds of volunteers then assembled in the dark, and you see them here. And the audience's gaze actually became one of enemy surveillance. They saw ghost-like, this other ghost of Skype, they saw ghost-like superimposed images, which you see on the left, that were projected on these screens you see on the right, that had been captured and projected via infrared television cameras, equipment that was classified at the time for US military research. They actually got these from Japan. So these media transmissions themselves were continually foiled by failure. On opening night, the rackets malfunctioned so that the lights actually had to be manually switched off in time with each volley in a kind of theatrical sleight of hand. And the infrared didn't work either. As the filmmaker Robert Breer, who was operating the cameras, said, quote, "There were about 2,500 people out there chafing at the bit and nothing worked," end quote. After a desperate scramble, the equipment was fixed. And this double-sidedness of the system, unnoticed when working, but suddenly conspicuous when broken down, seemed to mirror or reflect Rauschenberg's own understanding of the effect of infrared light as the revelation of a struggle. He said, quote, "The conflict of not being able to see an event that is taking place right in front of you, except through a reproduction, is a kind of double exposure of action, a screen of light and a screen of darkness," end quote. In the same way, the system of 9 evenings continued to wax and wane, come in and out of view throughout all of the performances. Each piece pushed or rerouted the capabilities of existing technology, whether creating portable brainwave sensors or devising those personal wireless handheld transistor radios you saw. And not surprisingly, these warped systems crashed and burned, creating long delays each night, sometimes hours long. But when they did work, they produced an incredible complex of flows, of currents, waves, sound, and light, bodies, a double exposure of imperceptible and perceptible signals. And this is another view of open score. This trembling sort of oscillation of connection and interruption, of vision and darkness, resembled nothing less than the responsive environment that Rauschenberg had spoken of in the years leading up to 9 evenings. For him, this space of interaction, of remote control, had grown to encompass both relationships but also alienation, the links but also the disconnect between sender and receiver, signal and noise. The player's movements in open score became part of a level field of action between lights, speakers, and performers, but this field was broken by disruption, disorientation, and delay. In the same way, Rauschenberg had worked to ensure a sense of dislocation, of sensation and movement in the audience. He said, quote, "You had a sense of distance that was distorted. You had the feeling of the possibility of knowing where you were, but where you were was lost," end quote. All the works of 9 evenings inhabited a space of fissures and temporal lags. And it was in this sense that Kluver explicitly positioned 9 evenings against much of the kinetic art of the time, against what he called, quote, flashing lights and psychedelic effects. So 9 evenings really became a matter less of stage design or spectacular sights than of creating an underlying system unlike anything previously invented, a dynamic electronic interface between people, things, and information. So one can understand 9 evenings as a kind of network governed by a single interface, running through one control panel, a membrane of mutual exchange between body and machine, between completely different and incommensurate domains of knowledge, of physical sensation and mechanical response, of fingertip and microchip. And when, just 2 months after 9 Evenings in 1966, we see the formation of EAT, we're seeing this concept of a local network with a single interface, hyperbolically scaling up to a global one, action at the greatest distance possible. EAT was an attempt to build a radically expanded network across completely different disciplinary and epistemological fields, one in which fleeting likenesses among personal sensibility, interest, and expertise might be technologically automated, even algorithmically matched. The first meeting for EAT took place on November 30th in 1966 in the smooth hotel lobby of the Central Plaza Hotel in New York. Rauschenberg and Kluver, who you see speaking, presided over an audience of 300 artists who had responded to an open call for members. The group collected 80 requests for technical help that night. So artists saying, I'm interested in lasers. EAT rented a loft in New York and began matching artists' requests with engineers' interests. They developed a remarkable card filing system that could store, retrieve, and correlate the data that artists and members entered. So it's a little bit hard to see here, but I'm not going to get into this somewhat actually primitive punch card system. But you could check off, if you're interested in computers or holograms, and then an engineer could check off, what their expertise was, and then you could actually match people this way. Robert Morris, the artist, wrote in his 1968 membership form that he wanted to explore new materials. Quote, "I wish to find transparent plastics with a large range of flexibility. I want to use these in fluid states, molding, casting, and in connection with other materials," end quote. So he was recommended to a plastics engineer. EAT likewise deployed engineers to work on interactive performance by the artist Carolee Schneemann, on the electronics for the musician Steve Reich's 4 pianos in 1967, on a light sensor for Hans Hacke's photoelectric viewer-controlled coordinate system of 1968. And these would respond to bodies moving in the room. And on projects with many other well-known artists. There were hundreds of collaborations, from single pairings to group endeavors to longer artists' residencies in corporations. But EAT would not lapse into traditional models of collective activity, and you see a kind of crude organization chart here. Kluver wrote to the engineers, quote, we are against making an institution. This means that our headquarters will only serve as a tryout place where things can be tested. So it was not an institution. Instead of an entity defined by the traditional conventions of the government, the market, the academy, the corporation, or the museum, EAT wanted to do something else. It would operate through and between these existing traditions. It was to be a chain of catalysts, of constantly changing actors and events, a place for testing. And this also might be why the group continually flirted with traditional institutions of art, only to break with them, posing unprecedented possibilities for the production, the circulation, and the reception of art and technology alike. EAT introduced a break between the traditional institutions of modernism, in other words, and a new model of association. And again, we can talk about this more later, but you can see they're trying to bring industry, EAT, and artists together in a very explicitly non-hierarchical way. So this change, this idea or this desire to create a new set of structures, of institutions, really was made plain in one of the group's next major projects, which was appropriately titled, quote, "Some More Beginnings," and you see glimpses of it here. This was a major exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and at the Brooklyn Museum in 1968, for which EAT called for proposals from artist and engineer collaborations. And it was curated overall by the Swedish curator Pontus Hultén, but EAT was brought in to work on this special section of new collaborations. Submissions included computer-generated drawings and films at a moment when computer graphics themselves were actually literally just being invented at Bell Labs, and Haka's design for a room filled with steam. You also see some robots and other kinetic sculptures moving around here. This huge array of works registered the emergence of the digital and the electronic precisely at the end of an older regime of the mechanical. And they also reflected Rauschenberg's, again, own dream of an art that would envelop and respond to the viewer, an environment of sensory plenitude and continuous change, an interactive field that could somehow transform physical action into information flow, an art that was intelligent. And here you see a computer poem by the artist Stan van der Beek. Each proposal was also considered for an award, but unlike other art world competitions, this time the engineer and the engineer alone would be the winner. One of the winners was the engineer Frank Turner for a piece called Cybernetic Sculpture, constructed with the artist Wen Ying Tai, and you see this here. The work converted sound into light and motion. Stainless steel rods vibrated at 30 cycles per second and were illuminated by strobe lights whose rate of flashing was controlled by sounds in the environment. Going beyond simple physical motion, the technically sophisticated piece incorporated an actual feedback system responsive to environmental stimuli in real time. What was most striking, though, was the conflict that ensued after the piece won an award, or rather when the engineer won. The artist, Tai, was exhibiting widely at the time, but he had actually trained as an engineer himself. He was furious and accused EAT of failing to recognize him as the proper creator of the work, and he demanded that the piece be removed until he was rightfully credited. But EAT refused to budge. The exhibition more generally was plagued by crowding, faulty equipment, damage from audiences handling the works, and the need to periodically turn off electrically powered works to preserve their motors. So when they were off, audiences thought the works were broken. New media made a host of new problems for the museum. Then, in January of 1969, the kinetic sculptor Takis, who you see sitting in the middle here, threatened to pull his own work, a kinetic sculpture sitting next to him, that little globe, from the show at MoMA, arguing that the piece, although it belonged to the museum's permanent collection, was outdated and didn't really represent his practice. The events boiled over into a kind of strike. Takis, along with Tai, Haka, who was unhappy that his own work was turned off every night, and others, famously began the Art Workers Coalition, and they staged a sit-in in the sculpture garden of MoMA. We're back in the sculpture garden. And they would go on to protest not only MoMA, but other museums in the name of artists' rights, labor issues, and the Vietnam War. So this role of technology in the birth of institutional critique, the critique of museums and institutions in art, is not very well known. And the sudden spotlight on the engineer and the bitter clash between Tai, Turner, MoMA, and EAT revealed persistent but little acknowledged tensions surrounding artistic authorship, technological innovation and invention, and the division of labor, just as this protest paradoxically attempted to oppose a traditional form of institutional power by asserting an equally traditional form of proprietary authorship, essentially a kind of patent. But the events also demonstrated that EAT could not be assimilated into the traditional institution of the museum. So EAT really pointed to a different path, one that disrupted the myth of a supposedly single and unified creator, artwork, engineer, or institution. And the group escalated Rauschenberg's long-standing model of collaborative production and assemblage, his openness toward all entities as material ripe for making, whether people or machines, gold or junk, ready-made or something never made before. In the same way, EAT's unwieldy processes troubled hierarchies of artist and mere technician between tool and work, and it disturbed conventional notions of individual production and institutional possession alike. EAT even reshaped one of the most powerful institutions of the time, labor unions. In 1967, Rauschenberg befriended the prominent labor lawyer Theodore Kiel, who you see here waving in the suit with his hand, who led the American Foundation on Automation and Employment, a group that was dedicated to addressing the increasing technological automation of labor and the threat it seemed to pose to workers and their jobs. And Rauschenberg and Kluwer, you see, are standing to the left of Kiel. EAT and the AFAE decided to partner, but their alliance would not look anything like a normal labor union. At the very moment of the decline of industrial manufacturing in the West, the groups decided to confront the coming of post-industrial society, attempting to find new solutions that would embrace automation, and with it, new types of work altogether. This was no Marxist critique of technocracy, but neither was it an embrace of the brave new neoliberal world of immaterial labor and the service economy. The attitude was much more ambivalent, and the result was an architectural and social platform that the groups called, quote, automation house, something much more strange. And you see Automation House, which was a physical building, architectural renderings here. So Rauschenberg, Kluwer, and another engineer led the renovation of an Upper East Side New York townhouse into a new headquarters for both EAT and the Foundation on Automation to host classes, performances, artworks, installations, job training. And together with a young architectural firm, they designed a media environment that was supposed to be fully wired. But when Automation House opened in March 1970, the network was turned inside out. Surveillance itself became the focus of attention. So you see here, you can catch a little crude glimpse of the diagrams, but closed circuit TV monitors would be displayed throughout the building, and they would publicly broadcast live footage of activities happening in real time throughout the space. Video telephones, again, a new but now archaic technology at the time, and what they called a electronic secretary would play back the real-time events in the space, converting the material surfaces of architecture into an immaterial circuit of information and feedback. And so this kind of reflexive vision really culminated in the building's architecture itself. The goal was, quote, total flexibility, a totally controlled environment with total reception, in order to to kind of create a very supple yet comprehensive order throughout the building. One that again echoed Rauschenberg's dream of this immaterial sensory environment. Adjustable walls, a ceiling partition, movable lights, projection screens, frames, hanging televisions, and artworks would all sort of create a movable environment. And in this sense, the hardware was really secondary to the software of electricity, of temperature control, ventilation, illumination, acoustics, and information. The artist and the worker were to be sensorially retrained and reskilled in this intelligent space. And then I'll just quickly show, these are some more views of the building with this adjustable sort of ceiling grid where you could attach slide projectors and other equipment to the ceiling. Rauschenberg displayed his collaboration Solstice, made with Kluwer for Documenta in 1968, at street level inside the building. The piece set 5 rows of pneumatic sliding doors, sourced from a manufacturer of doors for airports, on a luminous pedestal. So when the visitor entered or stepped onto the platform, movement and sound sensors would activate the doors, and you would pass through, essentially becoming enveloped in a kind of 4-color silkscreen separation. It was almost like being physically surrounded because the same images were printed but in 4 different colors on the platform. As the doors open and shut, they appeared to pull a picture in and out of registration. The viewer was inside the machine, so to speak. I'll just skip over this, but let's just say this is another sound responsive piece by Rauschenberg, Kluwer, and the engineers that's in the collection of MoMA. But I'll get to this piece, which is your very own Moderna, in the collection of the Moderna Museum. And it's called Mud Muse, one of Rauschenberg's most ambitious sculptures of the period from 1968 to 71. And it was a collaboration with engineers from the Aerospace Corporation, Teledyne. Rather than being activated by external motion or sound, something happening outside, the work was self-contained. It was a gigantic bubbling vat of clay through which a complex series of pumps emitted gas in response to the sounds of the viscous clay itself. This was perhaps the apex of Rauschenberg's non-productive and chance-based conception of technology. Mud Muse was clearly modeled on EAT's wayward experimental method, the work's 4-year-long gestation undergoing trial and error and detour without end. The process defied any notion of linear technological progress or invention. It brought high tech down to oozing mud, to an absurd frustration of interactivity and remote control. Communication at a distance slowed to a thick ooze. Now, by the time Automation House opened in 1970, EAT had grown to 5,000 members around the world, with artists and engineers joined by the likes of the artificial intelligence pioneer Marvin Minsky, the sociologist Daniel Bell, the physicist Vikram Sarabhai, who is the director of India's Atomic Energy Commission, and many others. Numerous local groups, as they called them, of EAT had spun off in cities from Tokyo to Stockholm and Los Angeles. Here are more views of Mud Muse bubbling away, and you see engineers with Rauschenberg at the top. This is a project that was spearheaded in Osaka, but more about that in a second. Basically, the organization would construct, via many of these local groups in LA, Tokyo, New York, and Osaka, the infamous and innovative Pepsi Pavilion for Expo 70 in Osaka that fall of 1970, which you see here. And over the course of the next year, Automation House itself would become ground zero for the first cable television broadcast of artists' video, an international telex dialogue, and projects that work to exploit the just-launched international telecommunications satellite. So again, radically extending Rauschenberg's vision of remote control, EAT would go on to parallel the rise of AT&T Bell, their own colossal data network, its holy grail of universal long-distance connectivity, and the zenith of large-scale research and development. This was a boundless yet multiplicitous mode of organization that could not have been more different from the institutions of an older order of science, administration, and capital. Instead, it reflected and confronted a new techno-scientific condition, another world. EAT was hardly a diversion from Rauschenberg's singular vision or from Kluwer's own work at Bell. Rather, it was a transfiguration of both the large-scale research laboratory and Rauschenberg's own expressed desire to create a sensory interactive space that would constantly adapt to and for the viewer. And this is the interior of the Pepsi Pavilion, a spherical mirror dome that actually created, it was inflated, and it actually created what were called real and virtual images, essentially fully three-dimensional inverted reflections hanging in the round, along with a whole host of other stuff, which I can talk about later. And so with EAT, that kind of physical space of connection, that sensory environment that Rauschenberg had long dreamed of, transforms into the vast space of the network, the traversal and speed and magnitude of communications media. The local network explodes in scale to a global network, a vast proliferation of connections, communicating internally but also with each other across the world. If those earlier works that you saw were still resolutely bodily, scaled to physical experience, individual experience, one might see Rauschenberg's dream of an immersive environment as gradually taking another form altogether. The single sculpture or installation now supplanted by a massive, ever-shifting network of information and experience, experiments in art and technology. Thank you.